So, drawing from the article, we're going to examine an example of how immigrant adolescents in Barcelona experience subtle but harmful forms of racial discrimination, what Corona and Block term raciolinguistic microaggressions. So, these are everyday verbal or behavioral slights rooted in the intersection of race and language. And the research directly challenges the dominant narrative of Spanish exceptionalism that Spain has successfully integrated immigrants without the social conflict experienced in other European countries. So, Spanish exceptionalism refers to the belief that Spain has uniquely avoided widespread racism and xenophobia during its rapid immigration increase since the 1990s. So, scholars like Arango and Aparicio argue that Spain's adaptation has been smooth, citing low levels of overt racism. But this narrative often ignores the everyday experiences of immigrant youth, experiences that reveal exclusion, marginalization, and subtle racialization. So I want us to think about, even though this is happening in Spain, I want us to think about how in our work as counselors, this illustrates how dominant narratives can mask systemic inequities, an issue that is surely not limited to Spain. So Corona shares a personal story about being called Panchita, a racial slur for Latin Americans by a well-meaning parent. So the story underscores how casual racism hides behind politeness or cultural ignorance. So as counselors, we want to recognize how this kind of symbolic violence can shape identity, safety, and belonging, especially for children. And I think it mirrors how students in the US may experience microaggressions that are overlooked because they are not overt. So, race is not biological, it is a social and political construct that shapes perceptions and power. Racism includes attitudes or systems that subordinate people based on race. Racial microaggressions are seemingly small acts that subtly communicate inferiority or exclusion. So, raciolinguistics investigates how language becomes a site of racial power. For counselors, I think these terms help us critically analyze our own practice and our work with clients' experiences, particularly when identity, language, and race intersect. So the research is based in Catalonia, where Catalan, not Spanish, is the language of instruction. So immigrant students, especially racialized ones, face expectations to adopt Catalan fluently as a sign of integration. Yet they're often denied full belonging regardless of their language skills. So in the US, think about how English learners, especially from immigrant or minoritized backgrounds, may be similarly racialized through language. So, language again is not neutral. It is deeply tied to identity and feelings of legitimacy. So, school stories are personal accounts that students share about their lived experience in educational settings. Corona and Block treat these stories as counter stories. So, they challenge official narratives and invite us to see what lies beneath them. So, as future counselors and therapists, we want to listen for and uplift these kinds of narratives from our clients. They often reveal truths that institutional data misses. Oscar and Pedro, two Bolivian students in the article, recount a teacher calling their classmate a monkey and threatening them with language, suggesting that they were gang members. So while this may sound overt, the teacher likely didn't perceive himself as racist. That's the danger of aversive racism, when those in authority minimize harm because they think their actions are benign. So this echoes scenarios in the United States schools where Black or Brown students are over disciplined or misunderstood based on racialized assumptions. Alex, a Romanian student, is asked to write about being proud to be Catalan. He complies but adds, I am Romanian and I'm proud to be Romanian. His teacher publicly ridicules his hesitation, and later she declares, You are Catalan, simply because he thinks in Catalan. So this story shows how language becomes a tool of forced identity. As counselors, we want to honor clients' multifaceted identities rather than pressure them to assimilate into a dominant culture. Fatia, who is a Moroccan student who speaks fluent Catalan, is singled out by a teacher who switches to Spanish upon seeing her. So, despite her corrections, the teacher assumes she's not a legitimate Catalan speaker. And I think Fatia's story highlights how racialized bodies are read as linguistically deficient. So, this resonates with how multilingual students in the United States are sometimes underestimated or placed in remediation based solely on their appearance or accent, despite being fluent in English. So, across these stories, we see three key patterns: language as exclusion, so switching codes based on appearance; identity imposition, where we're assigning identities that disregard self identification; and racial stereotyping, which is linking students, in this case, to negative tropes like gangs or backwardness. So, of course, these are not unique to Spain. In the United States, we want to stay alert to how these same dynamics manifest in things like teacher bias, student referrals, language assessments, or even how we frame support services. European looking immigrants, those from Eastern Europe or white Latin America, tend to be more easily accepted as Catalan speakers. So students of color, by contrast, face automatic language switching and exclusion. So these racialized perceptions map onto a colonial mentality, who basically thinking through things like who is assumed to be capable, who is not. So we want to deconstruct the racial codes embedded in linguistic assumptions and fight against this gatekeeping, especially in educational and mental health contexts. So, this article argues that Spain's lingering colonial attitudes, especially towards Latin America and Africa, shape contemporary racism. And it looks at how schools often fail to teach history critically, perpetuating the myth in this case of Spain as a benevolent colonizer. So, I mean, again, much implication and relevancy for US, but in I think in counselors education, we want to challenge historical silences. So think through how often do our case studies or textbooks include immigrant families, refugees, or multilingual learners as the norm. I think we're doing better, but I think we could go even further. So, the idea that Spain avoided racism has created complacency, and these counter stories refute that. So, like the United States myth of color blindness, Spanish exceptionalism obscures harm and inhibits reform. So, I think we want to help our students uh, and clients interrogate dominant narratives and give space for lived realities, especially of racialized and linguistic minorities, to be able to come forward. And we can't support what we don't see. So, I mean, this article is basically calling for a critical multidisciplinary approach to the social sciences. It's asking for inclusive curricula that reflects diverse identities and colonial histories, teacher training to recognize and disrupt microaggressions, safe spaces for students in this case to process exclusion and assert identity. I think for counseling programs, this means again embedding multicultural competence across the curriculum, not just as an add on, but as a core ethical obligation. So let's move beyond the myth of Spanish exceptionalism and by extension, the myth in any society that racism and exclusion are behind us. So for school counselors, the takeaway is clear: listen deeply to student stories, notice when language or classroom culture marginalizes students, and be brave enough to name ratiolinguistic microaggressions even when others downplay them. But for those of you preparing to become mental health counselors or marriage and family therapists, the implications, I think, maybe even run deeper. So, as mental health counselors, you may encounter clients, immigrants, refugees, first gen youth, who have internalized years of subtle exclusion. So, they may not name these experiences as trauma, but you'll see the effects in shame, perfectionism, chronic anxiety, or identity confusion. So, raciolinguistic microaggressions often manifest as cumulative stress, we could call this, and others call this, psychological weathering, right? So your role is not only to validate these experiences, but to explore the meaning clients assign to language, culture, and belonging. So language loss, accent discrimination, or linguistic switching in therapy are all clinical material. As marriage and family therapists, you'll work with families navigating intergenerational and intercultural tensions. A parent may insist on maintaining the home language while a child resists it to feel more American, or a grandparent may be dismissed because their accented English is viewed as less than. So these aren't just communication problems, they're a reflection of systemic power and historical trauma. So part of your systemic formulation should include how race and language interact within the family's cultural ecosystem. So finally, for all of us in any counseling field, really, we want to realize that we are not neutral. Every clinical interaction is situated in systems of power. Every intake form, language preference, checkbox, or referral conversation has the potential to include or exclude. And so our continued ethical responsibility, which I pretty much emphasize in every class, is to cultivate linguistic humility, to acknowledge our own bias around standard quote unquote language, and to challenge institutional practices that perpetuate exclusion. So true integration in schools and clinics and communities requires that we not only include immigrant and racialized voices, but center them as producers of knowledge and as experts of their lived experiences. And that begins with listening and continues with action.